Hello, I'm John Paris, your friendly neighborhood United Methodist Action Director for the Institute on Religion and Democracy. I'm pleased to be joined today by Professor Ken Collins, a professor of historical theology and Wesley studies at Asbury Seminary, an ordained United Methodist minister and IRD board member, as well as Professor Rob Wall, who is the Paul T. Walls Professor of Scripture and Wesleyan Studies at Seattle Pacific Seminary and an elder in the Free Methodist Church. I'll put their fuller bios in the text, but they are the co-editors of the recently published Wesley One Volume Commentary, just published by Abingdon Press, and it is basically a compilation of one chapter commentary by a different scholar for each book of the Bible for the entire Bible, and all of the contributors are from a church in the wider Wesleyan Methodist theological family. But why don't we get started by, Ken, could you tell us a bit about how this project got conceived and started?
Yes, obviously I work in the field of Wesley studies, and I had produced a major theology as well as a collection of sermons in order to pass on the tradition to the next generation. And in around 2012, 2013 or so, I started reading some of Joel Green's works, actually. He wrote, I think, two important works for Wesleyans on the Bible. The first one being Seized by Truth. I think that came out in 2007. I read that with great pleasure. And then he also produced Reading Scripture as Wesleyans. That, I think, came out in 2010. And then later on, he also produced, along with David Watson, Wesley, Wesleyans, and Reading the Bible. And I contributed a chapter to that, Scripture as the Means of Grace. I think, like a historian and a theologian, I'm always thinking about the next generation. How do we create tools, resources, that will communicate the genius of the Wesleyan tradition to the next generation? And so in a conversation that took place in 2014 in San Diego at the AARSBL, I met with Kathy Armistead of Abington. Well, she wasn't in Abington at that time. She was in transition. But we talked about this idea. And it sounded a great vehicle to communicate how Wesleyans read Scripture and to pass that on to the next generation.
And anything you would like to add, Rob?
Well, I come at it a little bit differently than Ken. As a biblical scholar, I was interested in how Wesley read Scripture and produced a chapter in the Cambridge Companion, which essentially summarized my findings, not only of reading how Wesley used Scripture in his sermons, but then how it showed up in his even informal and casual conversations. He was a person who was drenched in Scripture, who knew Scripture extremely well, and who appealed to Scripture to secure his most important theological as well as practical claims. I mean, he would never advance a particular idea or a particular practice without first of all securing it by his deep work and reflection upon Scripture. But my larger interest as an interpreter of Scripture is simply to figure out ways in which distinctively Wesleyan analogy of faith works its way out in how we read Scripture.
Yes. So, I mean, there have been, as you've alluded to, individual Methodist scholars of various denominations who have written or co-written books dealing with Scripture and theology. But I see that this volume, you have dozens of different scholars all together in one volume from a range of Wesleyan denomination: Church of God, Free Methodist, United Methodist, Salvation Army, Nazarenes. Do you know if there's ever been a particular Bible commentary or volume that has gotten this many sources within the boundaries of Wesleyanism, but that narrow, but at the same time this wide in terms of the breadth of different denominations all together in one volume like this.
One thing I would add, John, is that we also have Pentecostals contributing to this volume. One of the things that isn't always appreciated and known, something that Donald Dayton has argued, is that Pentecostalism is grounded and rooted in the Wesleyan theological and ecclesial tradition. And so we have Pentecostals, especially those who come out of those communions of Pentecostal believers that are Wesleyan in holiness and orientation, also contributing to this volume. So I want to expand the scope beyond the Methodist Wesleyan communion to include the Pentecostals as well, who would be interested in this.
Well, in a real sense, you know, as you just said, Rob, they are a part of the Wesleyan community. And I know in the introduction to our volume, I talk about speaking Wesleyan. You know, we talk about speaking different languages. And I think in a real sense, there is a thing called speaking Wesleyan. And so when different groups get together, whether they're Pentecostal or from the United Methodist Church, the Free Methodist Church, Church of God Anderson, whatever, when we speak to each other about Scripture, there is going to be a certain commonality there, especially in terms of who God is. That is, God is love, and Wesley takes that very seriously. God is love. And then that has implications for how humanity is viewed. You know, a full, robust love of God and neighbor. And so we're going to see that kind of language continually surface in those who speak Wesleyan.
John, let me get to your original question. With a very short answer. Something similar to this was produced called the Wesley Study Bible, which included notes at the bottom of the page that would help readers of Scripture track a more Wesleyan understanding of what it was that they were reading. And some of the same contributors that contributed to the Wesley Study Bible also contributed to the commentary. The 150,000 people who own a Wesley Study Bible should look at this commentary as its successor and a much more expanded version of that study Bible.
Yeah, I think Joel Green referred to our work as the Wesley Study Bible to the max, or something similar kind of language.
Several pluses, I think.
Several pluses, yeah. You know, the Wesley Study Bible is wonderful. I use it, but it can't go into the kind of rich detail and extensive development that you can find in a one-volume commentary. And so I think the two resources would work, you know, hand in hand.
So it's much more in-depth, in other words.
Yes, yes, much more in-depth.
So to go back to that, keep going on that theme of speaking Wesleyan and the underlying ideas and theologies there. I mean, there are lots of commentaries on there and annotated Bibles out there, and other things that are on both the popular market and on the academic market. And I mean, we could talk about the Wesleyan tradition in general, but particularly in this volume, what are some uniquely and distinctively Wesleyan perspectives that are really highlighted more in this volume that you might not find at all or as much in other commentaries and similar books that are out there on the popular and academic markets? In other words, what are some unique contributions and perspectives really uniquely promoted by this volume?
Thomas Aquinas spoke of the goal of biblical interpretation was to recover the Christian sense of the text. And I think what we're trying to do here is to recover the Wesleyan sense, not as something contrary to a Christian sense, but specifically the Wesleyan sense of Scripture, and it seems to me that that is unique, distinctive to this volume. And it targets not only those of the Wesleyan Methodist communion, but all Christians in the Church Catholic that might benefit from the accents, the emphases, the tones, the soundings that are distinctively Wesleyan in their sensibility.
And I think one way we could express that, what Rob is saying, is especially in terms of holiness and grace. I mean, John Wesley himself, in describing his own work, talked about spreading scriptural holiness across the land. What is holiness? What is holy love? And why is that so important in our reading of the Bible and also in practical Christian living? I think another theme that comes out very strongly in our tradition, and I see this not in a provincial way, but in a way that serves the universal church, is that the Wesleyan tradition has an optimism of grace, that we believe the grace of God is sufficient for the need of the sinner, and that the grace of God is transformative, both in terms of the forgiveness of sins and then also in terms of the renewal of nature. And so you're going to see a kind of robust doctrine of salvation that's fleshed out in the pages of the commentary, from various authors. And that, bespeaks of this larger emphasis of Wesley of holiness and grace, and with his optimism in terms of what God can do, not only in human lives, but also in human communities.
Yes. What might be one or two other distinctively Wesleyan emphases or perspectives or theological values that are presented maybe a bit more clearly in this volume than what people just shopping at their local Christian bookstore or academic bookstore might find otherwise?
One of the things that I appreciated by so many of our contributors to this volume is their desire to contemporize Scripture, not only to retrieve the Wesleyan sense of reading Scripture, and they did this through a variety of different methodological means, but also to adapt what they were finding in Scripture to an array of issues that we are dealing with today in contemporary culture. Issues of diversity, of inclusiveness, for instance, of compassion for the poor and the powerless, standing with them and seeking to heal what is broken in the world in which we live. Karl Barth used to illustrate this with his students by holding up in one hand the Bible and in the other hand the local newspaper, arguing that an interpretation of the one ought to have in mind the reading of the other. And so many of the contributors to this volume attempted to do that.
I think another thing here we could mention in terms of what would be distinctly Wesleyan and therefore needs to be mentioned so that those outside the tradition might understand this volume better if they work with it, is first of all our understanding of prevenient grace, that God has already acted. That's how good God is. That's how gracious God is. God has already acted even before we're aware of it. And so we become knowledgeable of that. And that prevenient grace renders us accountable and responsible. This means our commentary will be somewhat different than, let's say, commentaries that would come out of a tradition like the Magisterial Reformation, Lutheranism, Calvinism, because they don't have this understanding of prevenient grace, which is very much a part of our tradition and will be reflected in the commentary. I think I need to mention one thing very briefly so that those outside the tradition, when they pick up this volume, will understand it properly. They must understand from the get-go that Wesleyans define sin differently than do Calvinists and Lutherans, okay? And that has to be clearly on the table. I do that work in the introduction so that those from different traditions who define sin differently will take note of this difference and therefore read the commentary with greater understanding and greater depth.
Thank you. Is there a short two-sentence summary you could offer of a particular Wesleyan definition of sin?
Sin, according to John Wesley, is sin, properly speaking, is a willful violation of a known law of God. Whereas, for example, Calvinists will define sin as any violation of a known law of God, whether willful or not. Well, if you proceed with the Calvinist definition of sin, it's hard to understand Romans 6 through 8. It's also hard to understand, as Rob knows well, because he's done work in this area, the first letter of John. You'll simply throw up your hands when you get to the first letter of John. How could anyone be so free? And so, we need to talk about these things up front so that we from different traditions can understand each other better.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, where can somebody find this book? Is it available on Kindle or Amazon?
Yes, it's available on Kindle. It's in hardcover. Abington right now is selling it with the discount. They give like $1.20 discount, like $59.99. That's the same price basically up on Cokesbury. So I don't know if there's a cheaper price, but you can get it either at Cokesbury or at Amazon. You can get it in Kindle format, print format. Yes.
Thank you both very much for your contributions and for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.